Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of True Drew Podcast. This is actually our 5th episode. I'm so excited. I have had so much fun rereading these books, and today we're going to be talking about the 3rd Nancy Drew book, which is the Bungalow Mystery. Now, the original edition of this book was written and published in 1930, and actually the first 4 Nancy Drew books up until The Mystery at Lilac Inn were all published in that same year. And of course, the revisions that were done by Harriet Stratmeyer Adams were later done in the late 1950s to early to mid 1960s. And a fun fact, the original books are 25 chapters and the revised books are only 20 chapters. Now, I actually only have one original book, and it is The Clue of the Broken Locket, and I am so excited to, when it comes to that episode, break down some of the differences between the original versus the revised. But I would love to get my hands on some more of the originals with the dust jackets because they are so hard to find, especially in good shape. Now, if the word bungalow seems familiar, it's because we talked about it a little bit in the episode about The Secret of the Old Clock. The Tophams have a fancy little bungalow in that book on Moon Lake, and that's a nice bungalow. If you look at the covers on this book, this bungalow looks like it's seen some better days. So Russell Tandy, of course, did the cover for the original. And if you'd like to see, every week before we do our podcast on Thursdays, I like to post on our Instagram, True Drew Podcast, the different covers and discuss them because I think it's so cool to see them and compare because every 10, 20 years or so, they updated what Nancy looked like and they changed the covers. And some of them I like better than others. I also just love sharing all kinds of fun Nancy Drew content over there, whether it's memes or things about the Nancy Drew computer games and their soundtracks, because I am quite frankly obsessed. And I love interacting with you all over there. So if you'd like, you can follow us at True Drew Podcast on Instagram. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled programming. So when we're analyzing these different book covers, the first cover for the Bungalow Mystery shows Nancy in her 1930s get-up. She's got a scarf kind of casually tossed over her shoulder. She's wearing a cloche hat, and she's standing on what looks like a little wood box and peering into the side window of the bungalow. I absolutely love the Russell Tandy covers because there's so much of a Christmas card-like quality to them. They're just so beautiful and I don't know, they just really evoke the 1930s. I feel like looking at these, I could be back in the 1930s. Now, in the second version of this cover, and I actually found this again at a used bookstore, I have the best luck when it comes to finding Nancy Drew books, and they're usually under $3, which is awesome. But in this cover, we see Nancy kind of crouched behind a couch, and she's wearing a bright yellow shirt and a forest green skirt. Interesting color combination, but the rest of the book cover is mostly green. We see a red lampshade, and we see a man getting into a safe behind a picture. So there's a lot of action going on in this cover versus the first. I came so close to referencing The Sims, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. The couch that she's hiding behind is this white couch with these little floral rosettes all over it, and I swear, I feel like every time that I've made a house in the original Sims, I feel like they had this couch. But anyway, Nancy also, I should note, has the blonde curled hair. She looks more 50s here, and I'm not against it. I mean, it's a cool cover. I like this one and I like the first one, but they're not in general my favorite covers of any Nancy Drew book. Now for the third and final version of the Bungalow Mystery book cover, and this is the one that I grew up with as a kid, we have Nancy kind of hiding behind a tree, and there's some very obvious footprints going across this field, and there's this very dilapidated looking bungalow, the porch railing's falling off of it. It's in the middle of the woods, so it's had some disrepair. But Nancy is wearing a green dress. She blends in with the scenery really well, and then she's got her strawberry blonde hair that kind of flips out at the end, so very 1960s here. So I did come up with a cover spoof, and it is The Mystery of the Homeowners Association Violators. Because it looks like Nancy is looking on disapprovingly at this house, like, these people need to get it together. Their poor trailings are falling off. So I would say overall, I gave these a 2 magnifying glasses rating, because they're not my favorite cover, and I know it was probably harder for the illustrators to get this across, like, well, it's a bungalow, there's a mystery about it, I don't know, let's just figure it out, we'll just draw something. But if I had to pick between the 3 covers, I would probably be between the first and the second. The first because it's Russell Tandy, need I say more, and the second because there's just more action going on, and Nancy looks scared for her life, so it's very interesting to look at. Now, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the characters that are in this book. And of course, we have Helen Corning again. Nancy's dark-haired friend is how she's usually described. Then there are the Aborns, which are a couple we will come to find out later have been impersonated by some other people. But there's also Stumpy and Alma Dowd, the impersonators themselves. Laura Pendleton, who is an orphan who is going to go live with the Aborns. And the Donnells, which are a family that live nearby and know the real Aborns. Also, how the heck do you say that last name? Is it Aborn? Aborn? I think it's Aborn. I just looked it up, so I will just say Aborn from now on, but that's such a weird name. Not to mention Stumpy Dowd. Like, that sounds like the sidekick of some gangster. Like, he got his hand shot off, so it's just like, hey, there's old Stumpy Dowd. I don't know. Some of these names are so weird. And if you're confused about the Aborns and who their impersonators are, or even how to say their name, don't worry, you're not alone, because this book was a little bit, I don't know, it was a little bit sloppy, I thought. And I feel like sometimes in the Nancy Drew books, when there's cases of impersonators, they have to go overboard a little bit to like make you aware, like, oh, okay, this isn't the real person. That is the real person. This is an impersonator. I feel like they did a much better job at this in Mystery at Lilac Inn, but we'll get to that next week. Now, without further ado, I have come up with the briefest of synopses. Synopses? I don't know. I'm not good with words. Nancy and Helen have a boating accident and are saved by Laura Pendleton. They take refuge in an abandoned bungalow, not a fancy one, and Laura confesses she's an orphan but going to be adopted by the Aborns, who actually turn out to be horrible people. Hannah Gruen sprains her ankle, so Nancy goes home early and hears her dad wants help on an embezzlement case. Nancy receives a mysterious phone call, which turns out to be Laura, who runs away from the Aborns and comes to stay with them. But Nancy, plagued by the mystery, goes to investigate a shack, running into Mr. Aborn himself. Nancy comes back to investigate later while he's gone and finds a man trapped in the cellar who is the real Jacob Aborn, a man named Stumpy Dowd, whom Nancy had met originally posing as Aborn, has been impersonating him to get Laura's inheritance. He locks Nancy and the real Mr. Aborn in the cellar, and they eventually escape. Nancy is then found by Carson, Dawn, and Laura, and after the bad guys drive over a cliff, nice driving skills, the police apprehend them. I also came up with a newspaper headline synopsis, and that is, Teen Detective apprehends criminals pretending to be young ward's guardians to steal inheritance. It's a bit of a mouthful. So it's kind of funny, but in these first 3 books, there's a lot of money and just overall greed, because in Secret of the Old Clock, we had people fighting over this dead man's inheritance, and then The Hidden Staircase, we have these criminals trying to get these 2 older women to move out of their house, and now in the Bungalow Mystery, we have a case of identity theft and fraud. So it's kind of interesting, and I'm kind of interested to see how the rest of the mysteries play out, because I know there will be different kinds of motives going down the line. So I wrote down some direct quotes and things that I noticed in this book, because that has been so fun to me to just really dissect the books as I go along, because as a kid I just read these books and I didn't think anything of what I was reading. So it's kind of nice as an adult to go back and there's a lot more context. Okay, so we're starting off strong. My first note here says, Nancy describes Laura Pendleton as strange looking. And when she does this, for context, Nancy and Helen are out on a lake and this storm comes blowing in out of nowhere and their boat starts to sink. And so Laura is out on the lake in her boat and she goes to save them. And Nancy describes Laura as strange looking. And I just put, that's a great way to describe someone who's rescuing you and saving your freaking life. I mean, let's be real. Everybody's hair is probably blowing around like crazy. You're out in the middle of a thunderstorm, for one, on the water. Like, you all look strange, okay? Like, Nancy, you're going to pass judgment on somebody. You look just as strange. And I wouldn't be looking a gift horse in the mouth because, seriously, this girl just saved your life. I don't know. These books put such stock in appearances, but the fact that she described her as strange, I was like, do you want to drown, Nancy, or do you want to get in this boat? And another thing, what did I tell you guys a couple episodes ago? There are so many boat accidents in these first few books. It's crazy. And Nancy and Helen are not the best mariners or sailors. Okay, I'll stop ragging on Nancy and Helen's boating skills or lack thereof. But my next note says Mr. Aborn calls Nancy and Helen perfect bricks. So I'm assuming he's just calling them steady people, like they're dependable people. But I liked that. I was like, you're a perfect brick. Nobody would get that now. They'd think you were saying that they were dense or dumb or something. Now, the next note that I wrote down actually has to do with the Drews' house. And I wrote down this note. It says, the Drews have a modern pink and white kitchen because Nancy goes to cook something in the kitchen. And so I thought, modern pink and white. Like, I'm picturing like the 1950s, like pink and white tile, pink matching fridge and like oven and everything. But I mean, I have seen some really nice modern pink kitchens lately. Like, I would love to put some pink in my house. My husband would probably hate it, but I would love it. So the next thing I wrote down was that Mr. Drew forgot his house keys and broke into his own house. So this chapter, it like left off on a cliffhanger, and then the next chapter you're kind of like, okay, who is breaking into the Drews' house? And you think that it's someone else, like a bad guy, but it's just Carson. So there was a little bit of suspense, and then I was like, really? When Nancy goes to ask him why he didn't just knock on the door, he says, oh, I didn't want to wake you guys up because it was like late 1 or 2 in the morning or something. So I get it, but you made everyone have like a panic attack. I don't think it was worth that. So at a later point in the book, Laura Pendleton runs away from who she thinks are the Aborns, but it's actually their impersonators, Alma and Stumpy Dowd. And she calls Nancy for help because she has her phone number. And I thought this was so funny that I wrote it down. Mr. Drew, so after the person calls for help, Carson says, yeah, that's bad. Okay, I have to go to work. I mean, Nancy has basically just told him that it sounded like somebody was under duress and they're maybe kidnapped or abducted, and that's his response. So I thought that was hilarious. Now, my next note has to do with somebody named Don Cameron, and this is apparently some guy who is kind of pursuing Nancy. He must have a crush on her, but I wrote down Don Cameron likes Nancy, but Nancy makes him go to a barbecue with Laura. So I don't know. I guess she's just trying to pawn this girl off on him so she doesn't have to go on a date with him. But I don't know. He seems friendly enough. I mean, he helps them out later in the book, but I guess Nancy just doesn't have time for a relationship now. She's too busy with mysteries. Now, we're to the part of this podcast where I talk about the things that Nancy could add to her resume. And the first thing I put was Nancy Drew, pet sitter. So towards the middle of the book, Nancy is following a lead for her case, and she goes to talk to somebody at their apartment. And the woman who's there just kind of opens the door and is very rude and short with her. And then she's like, oh, are you here to walk the babies? And then she just like thrusts these leashes at Nancy and she just expects her to go walk these poodles. Another interesting thing that I'm just now noticing, we haven't had any mention of Togo yet, which is Nancy's dog. And he's sometimes described as being like a bull terrier, or he's a variation of different terriers. But I wonder when he'll come into the books, because I haven't seen him in the next couple books either, because I'm reading ahead. So another skill that Nancy could add to her resume is expert at breaking and entering. She actually refers to herself as a housebreaker and spy when she goes back to the bungalow, and then she goes back to the Aborns, which the Dowds are now like inhabiting their house because they're gone, and they've basically just assumed their whole lives. They took their house, they tried to take, their ward, their girl that they adopted that was gonna, inherit a bunch of money. So yeah, Nancy is great at breaking and entering. Okay, so I also like to do a segment called What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. And sometimes there's quite a few things that she cooks in the book. She only cooked a few things in this book, but I thought it was interesting how she did it. So basically, I mentioned earlier on in the synopsis that Hannah sprains her ankle and Nancy comes home early from her vacation to check on her. Well, the day after Hannah sprained her ankle, she's in the kitchen making pancakes and sausages. And so I was just thinking like, wow, she's a trooper. She like goes up to Nancy's room on crutches and then she's like, breakfast is ready. And she just hobbles off. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, I know she's your housekeeper, but like give her the day off. Tell her to like rest, take it easy, something. Like the last thing we need is for poor Hannah to fall down the steps carrying pancakes and sausages up to Nancy so she can have breakfast in bed. I think that Hannah Gruen is one of the most underrated characters in the Nancy Drew books. And honestly, she does way more than cooking. Like later on in the series, she helps Nancy with espionage and catching bad guys sometimes in indirect ways. So yeah. We got to take care of Hannah. Okay, so I took some time to write down some things that I liked about the Bungalow Mystery and some things that I didn't like. So the first thing that I really liked about this book was the fact that Nancy went back home to check on Hannah. Because, I mean, Hannah is so important. She helps around the house, she cooks, she loves Nancy, and she loves Carson like they're her own family. And so I love the fact that Nancy dropped everything to go back and help her. Because Hannah is like going 24/7. If you read these books, she's always doing something. So I like that Nancy went to check on her. It shows that she cares about her. The next thing that I liked about this book was kind of unexpected. So Miss Dowd, Alma Dowd, who is impersonating Miss Aborn, said she wanted to change her ways when the police are arresting them after they've gone over that cliff and wrecked their car. And I thought this was kind of a neat redemption point because a lot of the times the villains in these stories are just like, I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for the meddlesome Nancy Drew. So I like the fact that Miss Dowd said she wanted to turn away from her criminal behavior. Now on to the things that I didn't like. I honestly thought that this mystery was really sloppy. I don't know. I think it was just the impersonator aspect and Laura running away and then going on dates to random barbecues. It was just very sloppy and not as neatly tied together as the first two books, in my opinion. I also kind of wish that Helen Corning had stuck around to help Nancy because she just kind of runs off with her aunt. I mean, I know she has like already had previous plans, like a vacation or something, but it was just kind of weird how Nancy's like all into mystery solving. They literally went down in a boat together and then Helen's like, okay, bye. So for that reason, I gave the Bungalow Mystery an overall magnifying glass rating of 1. And I know that's really low, but I feel like the first two books were really, really good, and then this one just kind of flopped for me. And I know that there's way better Nancy Drew books that are coming, that are on the way, but this one just, I feel like the plot it left something to be desired. So yeah, that is the wrap up for episode number 5, The Bungalow Mystery. If you all disagree with me, I would love to talk about it over on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast. And for episode 6 next week, we're going to be talking about The Mystery at Lilac Inn. This next book was one of my favorites as a kid, so I'm hoping that it still lives up to that reputation when I reread it. So if you guys would like to read along, The Mystery at Lilac Inn is the next book we're going to cover. So until then, I'll see you guys later. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.